Hello, everyone. Welcome to this HIMSS webinar, How to Maintain Patient Care in a Cyber Emergency. My name is Mike Milliard. I'm Executive Editor of Healthcare IT News. As we've seen in recent years at health systems such as Scripps and UVM, cybersecurity incidents can lead to disruptions of care that sometimes last for weeks, and in some cases have led to serious adverse safety events. When cybersecurity emergencies strike, health systems need to be prepared to keep patients as safe as possible and ensure continuity of care. And so to discuss that today, we have Dr. Daniel Nygren, who's the Chief Information Officer at Maine Health, and Darren Lacey, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Johns Hopkins. Welcome, both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thrilled to be here.
Now, Daniel, I want to start with you. Some of our viewers may have heard this story before. I've seen you, talk about it a couple times at security events, but it's a pretty hair-raising story, frankly. I mean, this is kind of even in the days before ransomware became a thing. When you were at Boston Children's Hospital, you were hit with a DDoS attack, right?
That's right, Mike. This was back in 2014, sort of the dark ages of attacks on healthcare organizations, and we got hit by a really large-scale a DDoS attack, as you said, purportedly levied by the hacktivist group Anonymous, with the capital A is what I like to say. And this was a really arduous thing that we went through, lasted for about 2 weeks or so, and really put us to the test. I'm happy to give you a little bit more detail if you're interested.
Sure. I'm curious about what were some of the biggest challenges and how was care disrupted, and how did you, maintain, a high level quality of care as you were simultaneously fending off something that serious?
Yeah. So let me just start by rounding out a little bit of what we experienced. So in addition to the really high volume DDoS attack, which briefly at least compromised our network connectivity, both inbound and outbound, we also got hit with a massive barrage of malware via email. And we also were under a huge number of attacks meant to directly penetrate our firewalls. And so what all of that meant to us is that, as I mentioned, we briefly lost internet connectivity, but we also took some unprecedented steps at the time. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But those steps included temporarily, for example, shutting down our entire email infrastructure, and temporarily bringing down every one of our outward-facing web properties. So all of our websites, any kind of connectivity, FTP, secure FTP, things like that. Essentially, we shut down every open firewall port we had, just to minimize potential entry points. So clearly, these were massively disruptive things to us as an organization, but we felt well within the bounds of what we should endure so as to protect ourselves. And those things, led to downstream effects on how our providers were able to care for our patients. One of the things I like to point out that's so critical in any kind of cyber event is communication. And when we shut down our email platform, for one, I was temporarily, as an aside, I was temporarily a hero in the organization because I absolved people from having to do email for about 24 hours. So I was asked subsequently to arrange for that to happen once a week if I could. But beyond that, just getting things done within a large organization, you quickly find out how dependent we are on email as a communication platform, and how we get the word out to our clinical care providers and all of the operational aspects of a big healthcare system. How you do that without email is actually pretty tough. And so this is one of the big lessons that we learned as part of that process. And one of the things I like to talk about for other folks as they prepare for potential cyber risks down the line is to ensure that your communication channels are really top notch and multimodal, because you never know what one you may lose at any point in time.
Mm. Darren, have you ever had to deal with anything quite that touch and go?
No, nothing I haven't created myself. No, I mean it's no. I think that famous incident in 2014 was kind of a singular incident in many respects. It put a lot of attention both on attacks, because I think most of us in healthcare didn't really think Anonymous cared about us. Also, it really put the lie into denial of service attacks, which again, we weren't really spending a lot of time. I mean, at the time, the privacy security community in healthcare was still principally compliance driven, and just coming into kind of I would say a more adversarial view of the world. And this actually demonstrated why we needed to move more quickly. And then, of course, the ransomware increase in the last 3 or so years has underscored that even more so. So that was kind of for in healthcare, it was one of the main non-exfiltration events, and maybe until the ransomware increase in the last couple of years, maybe the most visible one. So we all learned from it. Daniel and his colleagues did a great job of explaining it to folks, and so we all took notes and we built our resilience plans accordingly. I will say this though, and I think this is important for the security community, as we build more and more automated tools for essentially, we rely on essentially third parties. I mean, firewall vendors, we don't sit around and put in 400,000 blocks a day. That's done by the vendors working on essentially probabilistic accounts of risk. Probabilistic accounts of risk often go wrong. So what you can see is interruptions of sort of critical systems or communications channels or those types of things that are caused by your security rules, not that they're preventing. With the idea that if they're caused by them, they can be remediated fairly quickly. You can respond and get things right fairly quickly. Whereas actually, if you don't have the defenses, the attack will become will metastasize and be a complete mess. But I think everybody in the security community, we should do a better job of communicating that our tools are not completely under our control. They're under our firewall vendors, our endpoint defense vendors, our threat vendors. All these types of vendors basically come together and they block certain things and they stop certain things, and sometimes that's not right and it has to be sort of worked out. So downtime isn't just the attackers attacking you; it's you responding. And I think that's one we haven't really communicated that well. I think to the larger technology and clinical communities.
You talked about that probabilistic approach. It's just the sad fact of life now that the probability of something like this happening is just immensely greater. I mean, what was an isolated incident back in 2014, 8 years later, is almost a weekly occurrence. And we've seen some pretty high profile outages that have lasted weeks. We've seen, in Germany, there was a case where a patient died because she had to be rerouted to a different hospital because the other one was experiencing a ransomware attack. There was a baby in Alabama. It's getting very serious out there and rather scary for patient safety. So, I mean, how has that changed the way both of you think about, your jobs?
I'll start, Mike. Absolutely. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Many folks in our industry now, as you know, are not talking so much as an if event for these things and more so as a when. And so with that in mind, and this going back to our 2014 Anonymous event is something that we were able to take advantage of, and that's planning. One of the most important things that we all can do is simply to plan for these things and to have processes and procedures in place so that if and when they occur, that we're not left sort of figuring it out on the fly. So we were fortunate in our event at Boston Children's to have gotten a little bit of a heads up from the attackers that they were threatening us and this was maybe coming down the pike. And we use those preceding few weeks to get our act together and to have some strategies. And so again, fast forward 8 years, I think many of us, all of us hopefully have started to work on those similar kinds of strategies for each of our organizations. And it's so critical to test these things, to revisit them periodically to make sure that they're current, because without a plan for what you're going to do when that call happens in the middle of the night or whenever it is, you're going to be scrambling. And so it's one of the first things that I tell folks is to make sure that you've at least assembled the right teams and the people and the processes and procedures that you're gonna activate if and when this all happens.
What are some of the key must-haves then on those planning lists? Does it vary depending on the organization, or are there some kind of across the board table stakes that you want to have thought about in the event of something like this?
Well, I'll start, Mike, and then Darren, you can jump in. I'll talk a little bit on the clinical side, since that's the focus of this discussion. One of the things we learned at Boston Children's was the reliance on paper that we're going to have, and in our world now where we rely on EHRs and clinicians are accustomed to solely working in EHRs, they're not used to having to operate in a paper-based world. So one of the remarkable things that I'll never forget is just how special our more senior clinicians felt, nurses, doctors, everyone, because all of a sudden they were valued in a way that they had never been valued before. Obviously, we always look to them for their clinical expertise, but all of a sudden we were looking to them for how to operate in a manual paper-based world. And they were like, well, come here, you young boys and girls, and we'll show you how it's done with a paper chart. And here's how you flag an order. Here's how you write an order for a prescription or a care item for a patient. And most clinicians nowadays have never done those things. So having that paper-based workflow mapped out, having the actual paper forms and things available were really critical items for us, and I think for any organization nowadays. We talked about and we created parallels to what we commonly use in a clinical setting, the notion of a code cart. When a patient has a life-threatening event, all of the medications and so on are there. Well, we now have downtime code carts, if you will, that include all of the important forms and paper-based items that would need to be put in place for a situation like this. So those are the kinds of things that I think are absolutely of critical importance for the clinical care to be delivered adequately.
Darren, any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a big difference between now and 5 or 6 years ago in terms of preparation for these things. And I'm going to talk to the IT side. Most of us now rely on third parties for essentially our large parts of our IT infrastructure. So there are very few on-prem Microsoft exchanges anymore, on-premise Microsoft exchanges. Many of us use Box or OneDrive or something like that, Dropbox. So our tooling and our dependencies are much, let's say, vaguer than they were in the past. So it's quite possible that you'll have an outage where the only thing up and running, your whole network is down, but email works great because you're all on Exchange, or vice versa. Email may not work for reasons that are mysterious. And so the figuring out the dependency tree in terms of, especially what Daniel said regarding communications, is much more complicated than it's ever been in the past. And there's no actual way to completely get your arms around it, but you kind of have to start with everything's down, and then you have to basically preach the idea that some things may be down intermittently during a process, and it may not be you may not have a good explanation why they're down. They may just be down because of the dependency tree is so complex. So one of the things you do on the IT side is you really have to kind of focus on what your main communications and operational channels are, and what the dependencies are likely to be. You do a little bit of scenario planning, a little bit more probabilistic thinking, which is, that what's the 80% likely and what's the, 80% most damaging, and work your way back from there in terms of scenario planning. You'll never capture every possible permutation of this, but you can capture most of them.
What about communication with clinicians? I mean, is it worth kind of engaging them beforehand and kind of, walking them through the potentiality of something like this? And do you do, drills, say, like something akin to a fire drill? Like, if we go down, here's what you do, and here's what you're going to have to do with paper. And is it important to communicate with them, in advance of something like this happening?
Yeah, I'll start, Mike. Absolutely. Not just clinicians. I think it's imperative that we include all aspects of our organizations, because if payroll doesn't happen during one of these incidents, that's a bad thing, right? And so we need administrative folks included as well. But for sure, the clinicians are imperative to be a part of the planning. And what I'd say is, this is one of the reasons that our goal within IT is always to try and to minimize downtimes and ensure, 100% uptimes. There was always calls to see, hey, when daylight savings time flips every twice a year, can we avoid having that downtime that we always have? As an example, I actually like the fact that we take the system down for planned reasons, still on occasion, for maintenance upgrades or things like that. And the reason is that it allows our clinicians to exercise some of these downtime procedures that we talk about. Now, I do think that there's a big difference between, an hours-long planned downtime than a potentially days, weeks, month-long outage that some of our colleagues have endured. And I think that's an important point to recognize, is that some of these outages now are really long and have a really dramatically different impact on organizations. But all the same, I do think that practicing these downtime procedures as part of our regular planned downtimes is a way that we get our clinicians involved. And we try and educate them that, although it's frustrating having these outages, planned ones, that the silver lining is that it gives us some experience that might benefit us when we've got that unplanned cyber attack outage down the road.
And it's not just the clinical workflows within the walls of the hospital either. I mean, we saw at UVM in 2020, like their MyChart was down. And so that affects scheduling appointments and getting lab results and all, so it kind of extends into the community as well. So patients need to be engaged with this stuff as well, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. And again, thinking about multimodal ways in which we can communicate. So maybe my chart is down, so we won't be able to message them. But maybe we've got some SMS platform and have access to their cell phone numbers, and we would be able to message them in that way. Or maybe we still have a website available, externally hosted or something like that we could post information on. So just thinking creatively about all of the different avenues that we've got, whether communicating internally or externally, both of those are super important.
What sort of communication should you be having with your vendors as stuff like this is going on?
Aaron, you want to take that one?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that vendors, you should talk to your vendors, obviously. How far you're going to get is I think in question. But your primary vendors, you should have some idea of what you're doing. You should understand again the dependency tree. But ultimately, the vendors are only going to be so helpful. And I don't think you should hold out a lot of hope that they're going to help a lot. The thing is because they don't know really why things go down when they go down. They're basically, if Exchange goes down on the East Coast, Microsoft's got everybody to worry about. every company on the East Coast to worry about. If there's a big Amazon shortage, outage, it'll hit a lot of organizations in unpredictable ways. You can't call up Amazon and say, "Hey, Amazon, what's going to happen if there's an outage on the East Coast?" They'll route you to somebody that you've never heard of before and won't be able to help you at all. Mm-hmm. So I do think with some of your vendors, you should plan this out, but I think you're kind of on your own. And I hate to, counsel despair, but I think this is one where a little self-reliance probably never hurt.
That's fair. That's fair.
Mike, one thing that I'd just add is don't forget about the government agencies as well in terms of whom to communicate with. Mm-hmm. Again, going back to our 2014 incident, and granted, this was a different time where these things were not happening every day, and there was perhaps more interest in our particular case. But the FBI was very, very helpful for us, and in fact, ultimately resulted in the apprehension and the sentencing of the primary person involved in our incident. But I think as a matter of best practice, that's something not to forget is to involve those agencies as well.
Yeah, I sat on stage at HIMSS 22 in Florida earlier this spring with a couple special agents, and they were very helpful in discussing how and when and what you should be saying to them as you communicate with the feds.
Yeah,
so
if you're getting clobbered in a cyber attack, yes, talk to the feds, talk to the REN ISAC and the ISAC and to your vendors, talk to whoever you can basically, get some advice and counsel from, because they may be seeing it in other places. I was primarily talking about in terms of preparation, but if you're in the incident itself, you can be, no, you probably don't want to, post it too many places, but you should use informal channels to check out whether other folks are getting hit, get some advice. Certainly law enforcement can be helpful, and your vendors can be helpful, because at that point, they probably have seen stuff like this before, and they may have some advice and counsel.
And, if you're having an outage that's lasting into, several weeks, you're probably going to want to think about moving patients at some point to other facilities within the health system. Is that something that you plan for? Hopefully that doesn't have to happen, but clearly it might have to if this is something that's lasting into several weeks.
Yeah, I think this is one of those where it's very difficult to know in advance, Mike, and it's more of a, you got to see what the situation looks like, what the criticality of the patients you've got, what the actual care that you can provide safely is or isn't, and what clinical decisions you need to make based on those scenarios. But absolutely, I think, over and above cyber incidents, I think we all need to have those kinds of plans in place, whether it's a weather-related emergency or disruption to power or anything like that. Those plans need to be in place for all of our organizations.
Mm-hmm. Are there types of attacks that concern you more than others? We've talked about ransomware, we talked about DDoS. They're different, but the effect is essentially the same, of just massive disruption and confusion. Do you prepare for them differently, or is it just, you kind of try to forecast all eventualities?
I'll start, Darren, you can weigh in. I do think you've got to be prepared for pretty much anything these days. I'll tell you the one that I'm especially nervous about, simply because the protections are still not quite there yet, is attacks on our medical device infrastructure. Things like IV pumps, monitoring systems, other kinds of infusions. These are things that touch patients. And for one, they're difficult to remediate because they're so costly to remediate. We've got millions and millions of dollars sunk into this infrastructure, much of which just wasn't originally built in a cyber age where they needed to concern themselves with this. So there are modalities now to start to protect these things more, but I am concerned about attacks that that at one point could infiltrate them, primarily because, look, these things are connected directly to our patients, and talk about something that could cause harm. Making all of our infusion devices go haywire would not be a good thing for patient care. And so that's one that absolutely is in the back of my mind as one that I hope we never have to deal with. But that's certainly one of the ones that we've not heard a lot about yet. There's theoretical examples out there, but we haven't certainly seen a large scale event yet. But I'm worried that might be looming in our future, and one that I think we need to do all we can to protect against.
What are some preparations for an eventuality like that? I mean, because that's not something we're just switching to a paper record can kind of be good enough. This is something that's pretty seriously life and death.
There are technical solutions that are out there. I won't start naming vendors for one, because I'm out of my element. Maybe Darren could, but second, I think, Mike, this is those instances where you need to think about, well, do I need to move this patient to a different facility, one that's unaffected? Because if your patient needs some kind of infusion or mechanical assistance that these devices are providing, there's no amount of after the fact protection that you're going to be able to add. You need to get that patient somewhere else where you can safely deliver that medication or deliver that therapy in a way that's not going to be compromised. So I think that's the times where you invoke those patient movement approaches.
Right.
Yeah, on medical devices, I would start with, well, the way you should start off, I think, is you basically think about okay, let me think about non-adversarial problems that could happen on a medical device. I mean, things break, and they break in unpredictable ways. And you may be patient zero in some sort of mechanical failure on your infusion pumps. So you should have plans for things breaking in unpredictable ways. Cyber attacks are a version of that. Right now, as of 2022, 2023 maybe look very different. As of 2022, it is much more likely that your infusion pump will break from something, from some other problem than a cyber attack right now. Mm-hmm. So you should, but the nice thing about it is you can build on your resilience plan on, you say, well, what if they take down our data center? Well, what happens if your data center gets flooded? Then you can basically build on the flood to figure out cyber. You don't have to basically follow two paths. In fact, what concerns me a lot is people like me, we're hackers. What we do is we break stuff, where people come out and say, tell me how you would fix your patient care situation. I am out of my lane in that. That is just not something I can do. I can offer some advice about what some scenarios might look like in cyber, but they're not that different than mechanical or other kinds of cyber problems, network problems, essentially mysterious AWS outages and things like that. So you build on what you've already got. Cyber adds a new wrinkle to it, and different kinds of cyber add new wrinkles to that. So we've done a bunch of Ukraine-Russia planning. For those looking in the future, there was a war back in Ukraine, Russia. And for us doing Ukraine-Russia planning was a kind of ransomware planning, but it was one where we decided that all comms were down, not just our communications, and that there was a fog of war because people were getting attacked. Multiple companies outside our sector were being attacked at the same time. So everybody was on edge. And what would the communications channel look like when misinformation is flying every which way? So you can take every scenario, but you build the scenarios in what you've already got. I wouldn't just start a whole new path saying, well, we really got to deal with this cyber thing. Now you've been doing this stuff since prior to Katrina. You can do this now. It's same difference. And that I think that's the most hospitals, most healthcare organizations, if they start with that attitude and think of cyber as additive and not a substitute for other kinds of problems, I think they'll have a more mature program more quickly.
That makes sense. Well, we're about half an hour into this. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you guys think is important to make note of as we're discussing this, and hoping that we don't ever have to deal with anything like you did back in 2014?
And Mike, I'll just reiterate a few things I've already mentioned. One is the unfortunate reality that for many organizations, this is potentially now more of a when rather than an if. Mm-hmm. And I think the other is in adapting some of the plans that organizations may have already had in place to accommodate outages that are much longer than ones that we had anticipated before. Because I think the response to those in many instances is somewhat different than a more shorter term outage that could be accommodated more easily. So I think those are two of the largest takeaways that I put out there and emphasize for the listeners.
Yeah, I have always only one bit of advice for organizations that are got to focus on a cyber issue. The main one is that the successful adversaries, especially in ransomware, are attacking your directory. Nobody wants to basically move machine to machine to machine. That notion of moving laterally, where it's like essentially hopscotch, isn't actually what happens. They basically take over an administrator account and they throw ransomware on tons of things at once. So keep your metaphors right. This isn't like a virus. This is more like basically I've taken over the console of the ship and I've installed malware everywhere. You got to protect you got to protect Captain Kirk's chair, and that's the key piece. So if you're going to do your penetration tests, your vulnerability test, protect your directory. It's not to say there won't be other kinds of attacks and weirdo anonymous DDoS attacks and those types of things that happen, and you may get caught up in one. I may get caught up in one. But most of the attacks, the damaging attacks, whether it's data exfiltration or ransomware, loss of availability attacks, are primarily through the directory. So MFA, testing your directory, making sure if new accounts, especially administrative accounts, are basically tracked and monitored and prevented where possible. All that stuff, do that first. All right. And this gets, and then other things matter a lot. I mean, endpoint detection, network security, all that stuff matters. You need all that stuff, but you probably already have a lot of that infrastructure in place. And you're saying, where do I basically focus my attention as an executive or a security person? It's on the directory. If you're not pen testing your directory routinely, you're not doing security. That's all there is to it. And if you can do it internal, great. If you can only do it external, that's fine. But it's protect that thing at all costs. Then your whole security posture will be much better than it would be otherwise.
Good advice. Great advice in this discussion. Thank you both so much for this really terrific conversation, Dan and Darren. Just a reminder that this session will be available on demand for 1 year through the HIMSS Learning Center. I want to thank both of you again for joining us, and thanks, of course, to the audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Mike. Take care.
That was great. Dan. Thank you so much. We'll see you around the neighborhood when you move up here. That'll be cool. Yeah, definitely. We'll go grab a beer one day. I couldn't help notice all those records on your LinkedIn page. So you're a fan of vinyl too, I see. Yeah, I saw yours as well, Mike. And don't get me started on all of that. I have a whole alter ego that I can tell you about one day. Okay, good.
What's your alter ego? I want to find out. I love a good Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Well, actually, down when I was in Baltimore, I had another life during undergrad and med school. I was a nightclub DJ. And so that's where I amassed my thousands and thousands of records. And ultimately that led to me and a friend forming a band of our own. And we released music of our own on other labels and ultimately started our own record label. Yeah. So I have a whole musical side to my life. Wow. So okay. Well, I want to hear some of this stuff. What are we listening for here? Well, so go to defectiverecords.com. All right.
Right.
We'll still see some of the vestiges of
DefectiveRecords.com. That's a good name. I like that.
Yeah. Well, the band name was called Glitch. And it was called Glitch because invariably when something would mess up with the technology we were using, it was all electronic music. You know, when things would go wrong, it sounded better than what we had planned to do in the first place. So we went with that idea for the band name.
Defective. Here we go. I love electronic music. Absolutely love it. And so this is great.
Go listen. We'll take your money on Bandcamp if you want, or you can listen on Spotify and all the streaming places and stuff.
Oh, this is amazing. Okay. Yeah, I've heard some.
You'll see my software creations there too.
I've heard.
Yeah, Mike, you opened up Pandora's box there. I have this whole other life.
Darren's a good music fan too. We've talked about music. Darren likes some good left of the dial stuff, that I also enjoy. So,
yeah.
You know, have you ever heard of Matmos?
Oh yeah, they're friends. They're friends of ours.
Oh really? Because one of them is is a Hopkins faculty member.
Yeah. So
okay.
My bandmate and my label mate, co-founder of the label, he's good friends with them both, and he talks with them regularly.
Oh, fantastic! Now this is great. This is marvelous. I'm looking forward to listening to all this. So this is good stuff. You got big props on this one. I'm going to listen to it. I'm going to listen to it right away. I'm going to figure out what's going on here. And
you got to click around because it's pretty varied. Yeah, from one track to the next, it can swing wildly in terms of genres. So,
yeah, no, this is fantastic. I'm looking forward to this. Yeah, so I really like Arca a lot. Have you heard Arca? You heard
Arca? I have not heard of that. No.
She's like a producer / musician, put out a bunch of records, very glitchy, quite energetic. There's a lot of it's dance. Well, it used to be instrumental, but she's been singing recently. That's pretty good. But yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to this. This is right up my alley. So I'll enjoy this immensely. So thank you. I'm glad. I have nothing to basically share other than I have nothing. You'll get nothing from me other than an occasional email. But I'm looking forward to this. Oh, awesome!
Very cool.
All right, you guys.
All right. Thanks again, guys. It was awesome.
Thanks again.
Bye.
See you around.